Welcome back to Uncle Fish. Today we're going to talk about loops in C++. Loops is another one of those really foundational topics. You will very likely see this in your day-to-day programming, and you'll very likely see this in lots of different languages that are out there. So let's get right to it. Thus far, if you've been following along with us and learning with us, you've seen that our programs have a general pattern, which is very top-down in nature and very sequential in nature. And what I mean by that is the code gets executed in this flow, right? You execute the first thing you see, then you execute the next thing you see, and so on and so forth until eventually you want to exit and get out. Okay. So far we haven't really had a way to do something in a repeated fashion. So let's say that we were challenged with writing, a really bad example, but let's say we were challenged with printing out 1 through 100. Again, based on the things that we've learned thus far, we may be tempted to say, okay, well, I'm going to do a C out, and I'll do 1, and then I'll do another C out, number 2, and I'll do another C out, number 3, so on and so forth, and I'll write this statement 100 times, right? This would be awful. Like, I don't think anybody would want to go off and do that, and if you think about it from the assembly language perspective, it would be really nasty looking there as well, right? So we need some way to be able to iterate over something or do something some number of times, right, repeatedly. And that's exactly what loops are there to do for us. And they provide us some controls, and there's different kinds of loops that you use for different purposes. And so we'll talk about what those controls are. But what does it do to our flow of things? So if you had to picture this, right, it's still top down, but we enter this cycle in here, and this is our loop, right? We're going to go do this some number of times, okay? And so if you're following along, then I hope you're thinking like, okay, when am I going to exit this loop? Right? That's pretty important, I would think. Under what circumstances do I enter the loop? That might be important, right? Depending on your needs. But imagine that if you don't exit the loop, how is your program going to finish? How is it going to get to the bottom, right, eventually, and get to that return statement that we're used to? You might be stuck in here forever, and there's a name for that. It's called an infinite loop, okay? So just keep these things in mind as we talk about the different kinds of loops, but what your entrance criteria is and what your exit criteria is, or condition, okay? All right, so if that all makes sense, hopefully, let's look at some of these examples. And then again, once you see it in code, I feel like it will really make sense at that point. So let's look at one of the types of loops. So one of the types of loops is called a while loop. A while loop essentially means while some condition, right, while something is true, then I'm going to do something, do some code, execute some code, right? Take some action. And I'm going to keep doing that action while this condition is true. So we have our entrance criteria, right? Meaning that we're going to enter this if it's true, and we have our exit criteria. We're going to exit this when it's false. So we've kind of met those needs, right, in our flow, program flow. So that's good. Just to make sure that this is making sense. So what we mean by this is this iteration that's happening is you come in, you're entering the loop, you're going to check this condition to see if this is true, then I'll enter the loop. Okay, so it is true for the first one, let's say, and you enter the loop. Okay, now we're going to, in our just example, I'm going to print something. All right, great. Once you've done that statement or set of statements, you're going to come back out to the top and you're going to check the condition again. And if it's true, you'll enter it again. And if it's false, you'll exit it. So you see how that works, right? You're kind of looping through here, and every single time you finish that in one kind of iteration or one cycle, you check the condition again, and you check the condition again. Okay? All right. Some students in the past think like, you know, I check this one time and then that's kind of it, right? So I just wanted to make sure that that was clear. So what are these kinds of loops good for? When would you want to use them? So while loops are typically good for when you don't know, you know, how many times you're going to go loop through something. So a really good example or simple example is like, let's say we were tasked with reading a file. So some files might have 1 line in them, some files might have 1,000 lines in them, who knows, right? But if you're tasked with reading files, you may want to use a while loop, right? Because if you had a file with one line in it, you would only loop through it one time. If you had a file with 1,000 lines, you would loop through it 1,000 times. And your condition would be something to do with that file, meaning like if there's data in the file, if there's a line, then I'll read it. And if there's not a line, then I'm finished, right? I've reached the end of the file and I'm done, so I can exit it. So I hope that makes sense. You can see, right, like there's multiple different a number of times that you're iterating in the while loop depending on some condition. There's other loops called for loops, and for loops are a little bit different from the while loop in the sense that they're typically used for when you know how many times you want to do something. So for example, I want to print out the alphabet. Well, I know there's 26 letters in the alphabet, so I can control that and say, hey, I'm going to enter this loop and I'm only going to do it 26 times, right? So it's good for things like that. It's good for things like iterating over data structures, which again we'll talk about later. This is still an intro course to it. So let's look at what this looks like from a format perspective, right? So there's a for, open parentheses, again, same thing here like before we do something in our code block, okay? And then there's three areas or things that we're gonna go check, right? And one of them is the condition, just like in the while loop, okay? But in this particular case, we may want to, because we know we want to do it at some number of times, we may want to have some kind of counting capability, right? So let's say I want to do it like 10 times, okay? So what I might do here is say, okay, I want to set a variable of int, integer type, right? And I'll call it I, okay? And I'm going to set I to, 1, let's say, okay? And I know I want to go do that 10 times, so I'm going to check in my condition to make sure that I is, within 10 or less than or equal to 10. And to ensure that I am incrementing I will say I plus plus, okay? And I can imagine, right, that this is it sounds a little confusing. When you see it in practice, and we'll go over that, it'll make a lot more sense. But just again, the main takeaway for right now at least is to just think of for loops as, hey, I want to control, I know how many times I'm going to execute something, so I want to do it that number of times, and this gives us the facility to do it, okay? Another loop is called the do while loop. The do while loop is very similar to the while loop. The while loop, if you remember, was we didn't know how many times we were going to enter that loop and do something. The do while loop ensures that we at least will do it one time. So at least enter the loop once. It guarantees that one-time execution. And you may need that in your use case, right? But it's very similar to this while loop in the sense of it checks the condition, you loop through it over and over again, but you will always enter it at least once. Here, you may not enter it even at least once, right? So for example, if you go back to the reading of the file, if I'm reading a file and the file is empty, right out of the gates, my condition is going to say, hey, there's no data in here, so I'm not going to enter it. So you never entered it once, right? But again, so if you need to enter it at least once, then you would use a do while loop. Lastly, there is another loop called a for each loop. This is I think for right now we're not going to cover it, but this is an iterator. It's used for like data structures, so arrays and vectors, things that we're going to learn in subsequent videos. Okay, but for right now, we'll focus on these three. All right. Hope all that makes sense. We're going to now shift gears and go look at some code and see exactly these loops in action. And then more importantly, we're going to go over the code together. All right, so let's move our screens over here. All right. Here is our while loop as our first example. And just like in previous lessons, right? I'm going to execute the code over here. I've already compiled it and have it ready for us. But over here, we're gonna go over what the code is doing, so you get a sense of it. And then what I urge everyone to do is to pause the video, think about this code, think about what you think it's supposed to be printing out to screen, right? And then quiz yourself, right, to see if you are right or wrong. And if you were wrong, then go back to the earlier part of the video so that we can, review what was supposed to happen. All right. So what's going on in this particular code? We're going to start right here because the other stuff we've already covered multiple times. But here we are setting a variable called I of data type int, and we're going to initialize it and set it to 0. And this is our while loop. We're going to say while, here's the condition we're going to go check. And remember, if it's true, we're entering it. If it's false, we're exiting it. Okay? So what this is saying is while I, which right now is 0, is less than or equal to 5. So is 0 less than or equal to 5? It is, right? So that means that that is going to resolve to true. We're going to enter the loop. C out, we're going to print out I and with a tab, basically. And then we are going to increment I, because I is at 0, right? So we want to now make it 1. And now once we've made it 1, it's going to hit this part of the code and again iterate back and check again. So what's I now? I is 1. Is 1 less than or equal to 5? It is. So you're going to enter it again and you'll print out I and you'll increment I. Now I becomes 2. So hopefully that makes sense, right? You're going to keep kind of going in through here and eventually you're going to get to 6, right? Where I becomes 6. And 6 is not less than or equal to 5. And that is your exit, right? This will result to a false and you'll exit the loop. And then we will print the line. Okay? What would happen if this was not here? If we were not incrementing it, right? Let's go see both of those. So first, let's see this one again. Pause the video. Let's go execute the while loop. What do we think is going to happen? And what we see happen is we have the number 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's exactly what we wanted to do, right? Was to print out from 0 all the way to 5. Now, I'm going to just, for fun here, we're going to take this out. Okay? We'll save it and let's go compile this and see what's going to happen, right? So G++, we should know what all this is now, right? While loop, and then the code, C++, and enter. All right, so it compiled well. Let's go run it. Again, pause the video. Think about what's going to happen without that. And you see what's happening. We're in an infinite loop here, right? We continuously are printing 0, 0, 0, 0, 0 to screens separated by tabs. And the reason that that's happening is I was set to 0, I is less than or equal to 5, right? So it entered the loop. Okay, so it printed out I, so it printed out 0 and a tab. This was commented out, right? So it's not here. So we come back to the top. Well, what's I still? I is still 0. So it's going to enter it again. And it will keep entering it because nothing is incrementing I to make this condition false. Okay? Hope that makes sense. And so now we'll look at a for loop. All right, so in the for loop, here we are again going to do something n number of times, but let's figure out what's happening. So here, this is my condition, right? So I less than 5. I'm initializing the variable. So if you remember the format of it, right? There was an initialization section, there was a condition, and then there was an increment and decrement, right? It literally is looking very similar to this, just in a different format, okay? And again, if you know how many times you're doing it, then this one will make sense. If you know that I might not know how many times I'm going to do it, if I'm again reading a file or doing some other things, then that's where the while loop will make more sense, okay? All right, so in this case, I'm initializing int I equal to 0. I want I to be less than the condition. If it is less than 5, then I want to enter this and do whatever this is. This is by do something. And then I'm going to increment I. Okay? Very similar, like I said, like in the while loop. So let's go see this in action. I'll clear the screen here and let's do the for loop. Oops. And you'll see here, right, we're printing out I with the space. And we 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, why didn't it print 5? Right? The reason why it didn't print 5 is because I is less than 5. It is not I less than or equal to 5. That's not the condition, right? So if I made this I less than or equal to 5, then it would have entered it with 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and even 5. 5 would have been less than or equal to 5, and it would have entered it. But once we get to the 5th iteration and we say 5 here, 5 is not less than 5, and so it doesn't enter the loop and it exits, and hence you only get 4. All right, let's look at now a do while loop. And so if you notice here, in the do while loop, the do is out here, and then comes the while and the condition down at the bottom, right? This ensures that you are going to enter this at least one time, okay? And then check the condition at the end, okay? And we'll run this now and see. And you get the same kind of 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so I get like the examples here, right? They're printing out this, the same thing of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 1, 2, 3, 4. But I urge the listeners, right, to go out, play with these, practice, and you'll see, there's lots of different ways once we get into some of the more advanced topics to where this will make a lot more sense, okay? If we look at the for loop, for example, we knew we wanted to do this like, n number of times, okay? But there may be some situations where within that for loop or within the loop, you want to kind of override the behavior of the loop, meaning like you don't even want to check the condition anymore, or you do want to check the condition anymore. So for that, there are things called break statements, right? And there are things called continue statements. So continue is a little bit more confusing, but the break one is pretty straightforward. So what this code is saying is, again, it's a for loop. Our variable we're going to initialize is I equals 1. We want to check the condition of 1 less than or equal to 10. Well, it is less than or equal to 10. So I'm going to enter the loop, right? And here I'm doing another statement. I'm saying if I equals to 5, then get out. Like, I don't want to do this break. I don't want to do this loop anymore. I want to finish, okay? Even though I told it I want to like enter it 10 times, right? So when I get to the fourth iteration, 4, for example, is less than or equal to 10, so I'm going to enter it. Okay, great. Is 4 less than 5? Or 4 equal to 5? No, it's not. It will get incremented. Come back. 5 is less than or equal to 10, so you're going to enter it again. That's 5 equal to 5. It does, and it'll break. Okay. Break again means exit from the loop. So let's go see what happens when we do this. Again, pause so we can see. And you'll see that we only are printing out 1, 2, 3, and 4 in this example, because again, once it equals to 5, we told it not to exit the loop, basically. All right, there may be the same occurrence, for example, that you want to skip a potential value and then continue, meaning like don't execute this code when this is true, but don't get out of the loop. And that's what continue is doing. So it's kind of like a skip, if you will, right? So I didn't go over this in this is modulus or modulo, but it's basically just like what's left from a remainder. You can look that up later, and maybe we can cover it in a different video. But the idea again is to just basically it's saying if whatever number I divide by 2, if the remainder of that is 0, so meaning like is it even? If it's even, then continue. Don't do this, right? Continue, go to the top of the loop, basically skip, okay? So let's go see what's going to happen if we execute this. Right? So hopefully you got that right. So basically what this was saying is skip this for even numbers, and so it's only going to print out odd numbers. Okay? And then the last example, we talked about this earlier, that hey, I want to print out the letters of the alphabet, right? And so that's what this code essentially is doing. Okay, so it's just one other example of taking, like in this case, it's not always int, that was the key here, right? I'm initializing a variable of char type called ch, and I'm going to set it to a. And I'm saying if a is less than or equal to z, then I'm going to enter the loop. After I exit the loop, I'm going to increment, right? Char, go to b, right? Is b less than or equal to z? It is. Okay, enter the loop again. And so on and so forth, and it'll keep going until it eventually reaches z. So let's go see this code in action. Right? And there you go. So it'll print out the lowercase letters and the uppercase letters of the alphabet. So hopefully that all made sense. Again, I know these are some of the basic topics, basic examples. As you play around with them, as we get into some of the more advanced topics of reading files and other type of input-output, I think these will make a lot more sense. But for right now, it's really important to just get that, kind of core foundational understanding down. All right. Thanks so much for listening.